The Romanov story begins not in stability, but in fracture. Their dynasty was born from the time of troubles, a season when Russia seemed poised to dissolve into fragments of memory and blood. At the dawn of the 17th century, the throne was an empty vessel, contested by pretenders and haunted by famine, war, and foreign intervention. The very air of Moscow was thick with uncertainty, the streets whispering of foreign usurpers and ancient prophecies fulfilled. When Mikhail Romanov, a boy of barely 16, was chosen as Tsar in 1613, it seemed almost improbable that such fragility could anchor an empire. And yet, from that moment, a dynasty took root that would rule for 3 centuries, stretching its dominion across vast tundras, forests, and mountains, expanding into Siberia and toward the Pacific, as though no horizon could contain it. But here lies the paradox that sets the tone for everything. A line of rulers that emerged from near extinction, surviving by chance and circumstance, later cultivated an aura of eternity, as though their reign had been destined by a divine hand. How could a family that began in vulnerability cloak itself in inevitability? Was their survival an act of providence? Or was it a careful manipulation of image and memory, crafted to conceal just how fragile power truly was? The record tells us of councils, oaths, and ceremonies in the Kremlin, of nobles swearing loyalty to a boy whose father had been imprisoned by the Poles not long before. Yet beyond the parchment lies the deeper riddle. Why did this boy and not another become the vessel of continuity? The Romanov ascendancy was never clean, for their very name was stitched together with threads of compromise, promises whispered to different factions, and foreign powers turning a blind eye. The empire they inherited was not whole but fractured, its people wearied by hunger and disillusion. That boy was chosen says less about destiny and more about desperation, yet soon destiny became the imposed narrative, cemented by ritual and proclamation. From the beginning, suspicion lingered. Was their story designed not only to rule but also to conceal? The dynasty that emerged would become synonymous with order, faith, and the illusion of permanence. But beneath the gilded coronation robes lay a truth that was always unstable. In the centuries that followed, the Romanovs wielded marriage as their most silent weapon. Blood was their bond, their currency, their unbroken thread, woven not only within Russia, but also into the very fabric of Europe's monarchies. From this first fragile root sprang branches that reached into the courts of Denmark, Britain, and Germany, tightening a web of kinship that made Russia less isolated than the myths suggest. And yet, even this raises questions. Did these unions serve the purpose of alliance? Or were they also meant to create a labyrinth in which bloodlines could be hidden, substituted, or extinguished without trace? If every dynasty in Europe was tied by blood, then erasing one family's line might mean burying secrets too dangerous to surface. The Romanovs' image was carefully cultivated. They were portrayed as defenders of orthodoxy, protectors of a vast and mystical land, and chosen rulers whose legitimacy flowed from God himself. Yet this divine mask concealed the more human truth of their origins, a dynasty cobbled together from weakness, fear, and political compromise. Perhaps this is why the Romanovs leaned so heavily into sacred ritual, surrounding themselves with icons, relics, and liturgies that sanctified their rule. If power is born from fragility, then it must forever be shrouded in sanctity to appear unbreakable. The story of their rise is not merely history, but also a lesson in memory itself. For every coronation, every procession, every portrait painted in shimmering oils was part of a great covering, a deliberate effort to overwrite the chaos of their beginning. To speak too clearly of the time of troubles was to admit that the empire's foundation was not divine, but accidental. And so the dynasty's own past became one of its first cover-ups, a silence stretching across centuries. It reminds us that concealment was not a late development in their fall, but was present from their very birth. What if the Romanovs were always less a dynasty of inevitability and more a dynasty of erasure, their crown forged in crisis, carrying within it the seed of doubt? As we peer into this chamber of history, we must ask, what does it mean that the family whose end is whispered as the darkest cover-up in Russian history was itself born from a silence carefully imposed? If their beginning required concealment, what would their ending require? And if their first act was to rewrite the truth of their origins, how can we trust the chronicles that tell us of their demise? The silence of their rise still echoes, as though the empire's marble halls carry not triumph, but the faint footsteps of truths never spoken. From this fragile beginning, the Romanovs would grow into an empire of splendor and shadows, their legacy already burdened with the paradox of power born from concealment. From the fragile roots of their ascent, the Romanovs wove themselves into a network that extended far beyond the Russian frontier, transforming blood into a bridge that bound them to Europe's most powerful thrones. Each marriage, each alliance, was more than diplomacy. It was a careful stitch in a larger tapestry that sought to make the dynasty indispensable to the continental order. Tsars and grand duchesses were sent into German courts, Danish palaces, and British drawing rooms, carrying with them the illusion that Russia was no longer a distant giant, but part of the intimate family of monarchies that ruled the Western world. Yet within this web of kinship lay another paradox. For the very ties that secured the dynasty's presence also obscured its individuality, leaving it vulnerable to disappear, not as an isolated branch, but as part of a larger concealed design. Consider the striking fact that Nicholas II, the last Tsar, was cousin to both King George V of Britain and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The royal photographs of the age reveal not just resemblance, but near identical features, as if the monarchs of Europe were mirror images wearing different uniforms. These uncanny likenesses raise questions beyond family resemblance. If bloodlines became so entangled, how easily could one be substituted for another? One face exchanged for its twin in a moment of necessity. When wars erupted between these related empires, did they fight as nations or as a single family devouring its own children? And in the midst of that fratricide, what truths might have been quietly erased, reshaped to preserve the appearance of continuity while extinguishing inconvenient heirs? This interwoven bloodline was also a shield, for it implied that to dethrone the Romanovs was to disturb the stability of every crown in Europe. Yet history shows that when revolution came, those same relatives offered little more than silence and carefully chosen distance. Why would blood so loudly proclaimed suddenly fall mute? Was it fear of contagion, of revolution's fire spreading across borders? Or was it the calculated silence of families who knew more than they dared reveal? The cover-up embedded in the Romanov tragedy may not have been confined to Russia's soil, but shared across Europe's palaces, locked within vaults of correspondence, never allowed to see daylight. Even before Nicholas II, marriages were arranged with an eye not merely to politics, but to secrecy. Romanov daughters carried their dowries of wealth and veiled knowledge into foreign courts, where they became both brides and emissaries of hidden memory. Letters between grand duchesses and their European cousins whisper of shared codes, prayers, and mystical inclinations that suggest a transmission of more than just affection. Were these women guardians of unspoken truths, tasked with carrying fragments of forbidden knowledge across borders under the cover of marriage? If their correspondence were ever fully revealed, would it show that Europe's monarchies were less divided by nations than united in concealing something that lay at the root of their power? The Romanovs also embodied contradiction in their religious posture. They presented themselves as unyielding defenders of orthodoxy. Yet through their marriages, Catholic, Lutheran, and Anglican blood seeped into their line. This duality was not acknowledged openly, for the dynasty required a singular image of sanctity. But in truth, the family carried a syncretic heritage that blurred confessions and defied official doctrine. Such contradictions are fertile soil for cover-up, for if the Romanovs themselves straddled conflicting traditions, then what exactly were they preserving so fiercely? Was their devotion a mask concealing not only political fragility but also spiritual ambiguity? The more one studies the Romanov bloodline, the more it resembles a labyrinth rather than a tree, each corridor twisting into another, leading not to clarity but to confusion. This labyrinth was both protection and vulnerability. It ensured that their memory could not be completely severed, for their kin lived on in palaces from London to Copenhagen, but it also ensured that their disappearance could be easily absorbed into the larger silence of European royalty. A vanished branch is harder to notice when it is entangled among so many others. When Nicholas II faced the final collapse of his empire, appeals were sent to his relatives abroad. Some records suggest Britain was ready to offer asylum, yet the offer was retracted in the shifting fog of wartime politics. Why would a cousin sharing not just kinship but uncanny resemblance refuse sanctuary? Was it mere pragmatism, or was it a recognition that the fall of the Romanovs served a deeper necessity, one in which silence was safer than rescue? The fact that these decisions remain shrouded in partial documents and vanished telegrams only deepens the suspicion that more was concealed than revealed. To dwell on the Romanov bloodline is to realize that their dynasty was never purely Russian, but part of a European puzzle where disappearance could be orchestrated not by enemies alone, but by kin. And if that is true, then the darkest cover-up is not the erasure of a family by revolution, but the possibility that those who shared their blood conspired in their silence. If blood is supposed to cry out for vengeance, why did this blood choose to whisper instead? Thus, the dynasty's continuity becomes its riddle, a line that bound kingdoms together, yet also ensured that its extinction could be masked as a natural end. The Romanovs survive in the veins of European royals even today, yet their story remains fragmented, blurred, and incomplete. Perhaps that is the greatest cover-up of all. Not that the dynasty perished, but that its survival was hidden in plain sight, diffused through Europe's crowned heads like a secret diluted yet never destroyed. And if the Romanovs live on invisibly, how much of what we call history is less an ending than a carefully managed disappearance? From the tangled web of bloodlines binding the Romanovs to the courts of Europe, one sees how power required more than armies and treaties. It demanded an aura of inevitability, an image that could persuade subjects and enemies alike that this dynasty's reign was sanctified by forces beyond human reach. The Romanovs cultivated this image through ceremony and sacred theater, draping their authority in the language of divine right, presenting themselves not merely as rulers but as chosen instruments of God. Coronations in the Kremlin became spectacles of almost mystical resonance, with icons carried through incense-thickened air, the patriarch's blessings echoing against ancient stone, while crowds pressed close to glimpse the shimmering robes and jeweled crowns that seemed less like human garments than relics of eternity. Yet beneath this sacred theater was a family well aware of how fragile their claim had once been, how easily the tide of history might have swept them away had chance chosen differently in 1613. Perhaps it was precisely this awareness that made them double down on ritual, for if blood and politics were uncertain, sanctity could provide the illusion of permanence. The Tsar was called Little Father, the protector of orthodoxy, the earthly mirror of heavenly order. To doubt him was not merely treason, but a kind of blasphemy. What greater shield could there be against dissent than the notion that rebellion was rebellion against God himself? Still, suspicion lingers like a shadow at the edge of the gilded icon. Was this sanctity genuine belief or carefully engineered theater? The Romanovs surely prayed, fasted, and confessed like any devout Orthodox family. Yet their embrace of mysticism seemed to extend beyond simple piety. They surrounded themselves with relics rumored to carry strange powers, with icons said to bleed or weep, with holy men whose authority was murky, yet whose presence was undeniable. Some courtiers whispered of talismans passed from czar to czar, amulets hidden with investments, protective charms unseen by the public, yet believed to shield the dynasty from disaster. Were these merely symbols of faith or fragments of an older, more secret tradition folded into orthodoxy for survival? The Romanovs projected an image of unshakable sanctity. But history is filled with moments that pierced this mask. The coronation of Nicholas II, for example, was marked by tragedy when thousands of citizens were trampled to death in a crush for gifts, a horror the court tried desperately to downplay. How could such an event, occurring at the very threshold of a reign, not be interpreted as an omen? And if the people whispered of curses, if foreign observers wrote of destiny soured at its start, did the dynasty itself not feel the tremors of fate beneath the surface of ritual? Each gilded procession after that must have carried within it an echo of that blood-stained field, a reminder that sacred theater could not always silence the darker signs. Ritual also functioned as concealment. The grandeur of processions and the solemnity of liturgies provided a distraction, a way to shift attention away from instability within the court. When famine spread, when uprisings sparked, the dynasty responded not only with soldiers but with ceremonies, hoping that divine imagery would pacify unrest. But have we not seen throughout history how pageantry often conceals weakness? The more elaborate the spectacle, the more fragile the foundation it tries to obscure. The Romanovs may have understood that truth all too well, and so invested in rituals that seemed eternal while behind the scenes the empire trembled. This interplay between faith and secrecy becomes especially striking when one considers the family's private practices. Diaries and letters reveal prayers, yes, but also an interest in mystical visions, prophecies, and interpretations that reached beyond canonical orthodoxy. Nicholas II himself was fascinated by portents, often interpreting political events through the lens of divine signs rather than material forces. Alexandra, his queen, relied heavily on holy men and visionaries whose influence extended into matters of state. Did the dynasty truly believe they were guided by higher forces? Or was this another layer of concealment, projecting divine guidance to justify decisions already made? The paradox persists. A dynasty born from fragility created the mask of divinity, a mask so convincing that generations accepted it as truth. Yet cracks became visible in the tragedies that accompanied their reign, in the whispering of curses, in the strange figures allowed to move too close to the throne. If the Romanovs were chosen by God, why did calamity stalk them at every turn? And if they were not chosen, why did they cling so fiercely to the symbols of divine authority? From here, the story unfolds into ever darker corridors, for the Romanovs' reliance on mysticism would not merely shape their image, but alter their fate. Ritual sanctified them, but it also opened their doors to figures who claimed supernatural insight, figures whose influence destabilized the dynasty and fed the suspicions of cover-ups that haunt their end. And so the mask of divinity, once their greatest shield, became the very veil that obscured the truth of their downfall, leaving us to wonder what was genuine faith and what was calculated concealment. Beyond the sacred mask of ritual, the Romanovs built their power within walls that were both fortress and mirror. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg rose like a jewel of imperial magnificence, a monument meant to awe not only their subjects, but the entire watching world. Its gilded halls and mirrored galleries reflected endless images of splendor. A cascade of chandeliers and marbled staircases seemed designed to erase any memory of the family's fragile beginnings. Yet grandeur has a way of revealing its own fragility, for every mirror also reflects the cracks. Within those halls, whispers grew louder than applause. Servants carried rumors through hidden corridors. Courtiers eyed one another with suspicion, and even as orchestras played beneath painted ceilings, paranoia seeped through the silence like water through stone. The Winter Palace was more than a residence. It was theater. Balls, receptions, and state banquets created the illusion of harmony. where foreign diplomats bowed and Russian nobles pledged loyalty under the glow of candlelight. Yet behind these performances, the dynasty lived in constant fear of betrayal, as though each dance concealed daggers in the shadows. The palace's sheer size made it labyrinthine, with secret stairways and locked rooms accessible only to a few, giving it the air of a stage set designed not for openness, but for concealment. What truths were whispered in its private chambers? What secrets were recorded in diaries later destroyed? What decisions were made in candlelit rooms where history would never reach? The family itself was caught between the splendor of public life and the isolation of private existence. Nicholas II and Alexandra withdrew increasingly into their inner circle, avoiding the broader nobility and mistrusting their own ministers. In the palace, this mistrust became physical. Rooms guarded, corridors monitored, access restricted. The dynasty seemed to be hiding not only from assassins or revolutionaries outside, but from their own extended family within. How can an empire endure when its rulers live as prisoners of their own distrust? And yet perhaps that was always the nature of absolute rule. The more a monarch is exalted, the more he is surrounded by walls until the crown becomes less a symbol of freedom than a golden cage. Life inside the palace offered its own contradictions. Children played in rooms adorned with priceless icons, their laughter echoing off marble floors, while their parents pored over reports of unrest and whispered prophecies of doom. Servants polished mirrors that reflected both splendor and unease, while guards stood watch, uncertain whether they protected the dynasty or imprisoned it. Even celebrations carried an undertone of anxiety, for every gathering was a reminder that the empire's wealth and power were increasingly disconnected from the lives of its suffering people. Could the brilliance of chandeliers blind the family to the gathering storm outside? Or did they secretly recognize that these same lights would one day illuminate their downfall? The paradox of the palace was that it both magnified and concealed. To the outside world, it embodied invincibility, but to those within it, amplified every fear, every crack in the dynasty's unity. The Romanovs could not escape the sense that the walls themselves were listening, that their words might be recorded, twisted, used against them. This atmosphere of suspicion was not baseless, for plots and conspiracies circulated even among relatives and courtiers, some driven by ambition, others by desperation. The grandeur of the palace thus became a mask for fragility, a stage where loyalty and betrayal were performed in equal measure. The architecture itself told a story of concealment, hidden passages, connected chambers, allowing movement unseen by the crowd. Locked doors hinted at archives and treasures inaccessible to all but the chosen few. Legends persisted of sealed rooms filled with artifacts never displayed, documents never opened, perhaps even relics of dynasties older than the Romanovs themselves. What if the palace was not merely a seat of government, but also a vault where forbidden histories were stored, guarded behind walls of stone and silence? If so, then its destruction and revolution may have buried more than wealth. It may have erased fragments of human memory too dangerous to be left intact. As the shadow of revolution lengthened, the palace became less a sanctuary than a prison. Guards no longer watched with loyalty, but with unease, their allegiance shifting as whispers of change spread through the city. The dynasty, once exalted as chosen by God, found itself barricaded within the very walls that had symbolized eternity. The mirrors reflected only isolation. The chandeliers illuminated only dread. And the music of banquets was replaced by the muffled echoes of unrest outside. In this setting, the palace ceased to be a monument to permanence and instead became a mausoleum for a dynasty still alive, its inhabitants entombed before death had arrived. Thus, the Winter Palace, with all its grandeur, revealed the deeper truth of the Romanovs. Theirs was a reign cloaked in spectacle yet hollowed by fear, a dynasty that performed eternity while trembling at every shadow. What greater cover-up could there be than a palace that dazzled the world with illusions of invincibility while concealing the reality of paranoia and fragility within? And if the palace itself was a mask, then what else in the Romanov story is mirror and illusion, reflecting grandeur while concealing despair? From the mirrored halls of the Winter Palace, the story moves inexorably toward the man who would carry the final burden of the dynasty. Nicholas II, a ruler born into splendor, yet trapped within currents he could neither master nor escape. His reign began with omens and unfolded under the weight of choices that seemed destined to corrode his legacy. To his subjects, he appeared reserved, almost timid, a czar reluctant to wield the iron authority expected of an autocrat. Yet behind this restraint lay a paradox, a man deeply convinced of his divine mandate, yet uncertain in every worldly decision. Torn between faith and doubt, ceremony and reality, Nicholas had inherited a throne surrounded by rituals of sanctity, but he carried into it the shadow of fragility. The tragedy at his coronation, where thousands died in the chaos of celebration, was taken by many as a dark prophecy, a sign that his reign would be haunted by blood. From that moment, a subtle sense of doom seemed to cling to him, as though fate had placed a crown upon his head not to bless but to condemn. What dynasty could endure when its ruler came to power through the trampling of innocence? When the first applause of his reign was drowned by the cries of the dying as the years unfolded, Nicholas bore the strain of being both a family man and an emperor. His devotion to Alexandra and their children was genuine, even tender. Yet this same devotion often blinded him to the world beyond the palace walls. He retreated into the safety of private life, surrounding himself with a small circle of advisors while shutting out the nobility whose support he needed most. To the empire he appeared distant, to his ministers indecisive, and to his enemies weak. Perhaps this was not weakness alone, but the mark of a man ensnared by forces beyond politics, omens, prophecies, and the creeping suspicion that his reign was already written in shadows. Nicholas believed in destiny with an intensity that shaped his decisions. He saw himself as chosen, bound to preserve autocracy, even as the empire strained under calls for reform. When confronted with crises, he often clung to symbols rather than strategies, seeking comfort in icons and prayers while revolutions brewed in the streets. To some, this appeared as blind faith, but to others it suggested something darker, that Nicholas governed not by reason, but by submission to forces unseen. Guided less by ministers than by mystics and omens, was he truly a ruler, or merely a prisoner of a destiny he dared not resist? The empire he inherited was vast but brittle. Industrial unrest spread through the cities, peasants struggled under centuries of hardship, and the nobility itself was fractured between loyalty and ambition. Nicholas faced wars that bled his armies and exposed the weaknesses of his government. Yet he clung to the notion that authority must never yield. To question his rule was to question the divine order. And so he resisted reforms that might have stabilized the empire. This resistance, born of belief in sacred autocracy, ensured that cracks widened into fractures, that dissent grew into revolution. Still, he believed himself shielded by destiny, as though the very disasters surrounding him were tests rather than warnings. The paradox deepened when Nicholas's private doubts surfaced in letters and diaries. He wrote of feeling unworthy, of sensing that fate was against him, of being a man trapped in a role too heavy to bear. Yet even in these confessions, he always returned to faith, as though divine choice outweighed personal despair. How can a ruler simultaneously believe himself both chosen and doomed? And what kind of empire can survive when its leader governs through contradiction, projecting certainty while haunted by premonitions of collapse? The world outside the palace saw Nicholas as a figure of weakness. But within the dynasty, his belief in divine right created rigidity, an inability to bend that doomed him to break. His devotion to family made him sympathetic as a man, yet disastrous as a czar, for he valued private comfort over political necessity. In this tension lies the riddle of his reign. Was Nicholas II merely a tragic figure caught in currents too strong, or was his indecision part of a larger orchestration, a cover for forces guiding the empire toward deliberate ruin as if fate were already written? Was it divine hand or human design shaping his downfall? The image of Nicholas II remains frozen. A man in uniform, eyes solemn, gaze distant, standing at once as father, believer, and emperor. Around him swirl omens, prophecies, tragedies, and betrayals, forming a cloud that never dissipates. His burden was not only to rule, but also to embody the paradox of his dynasty, born of fragility, yet cloaked in eternity, sanctified, yet haunted, chosen, yet condemned. And as his reign unfolded, the weight of that paradox pressed ever harder, bending the dynasty toward the silence that would soon engulf it. Alongside Nicholas II stood Alexandra Feodorovna, the last Tsarina of Russia, a figure whose devotion to faith and family was as unyielding as it was isolating. Born a German princess, she entered the Russian throne through marriage, carrying with her a legacy of foreignness that the Russian nobility never allowed her to forget. In the opulent halls of the Winter Palace and Tsarskoye Selo, she remained an outsider. Her accent, her manners, and her spiritual inclinations marked her as different from the orthodox aristocracy that surrounded her. The people whispered that she was aloof, cold, even hostile. Yet, in truth, she was consumed by a deeper preoccupation, the fragile survival of her family and the mystical shadows she believed held the power to protect them. Her greatest sorrow and her most secret burden was the illness of her only son, Alexei, heir to the throne. The boy suffered from hemophilia, a condition that left his blood unable to clot, turning even the smallest injury into a threat of death. To the outside world, Alexei appeared as a fragile child, now protected by guards and confined by caution. But to Alexandra, he was both blessing and curse, the embodiment of hope for the dynasty and the daily reminder of its fragility. In her despair, she turned increasingly to mysticism, convinced that divine intervention was the only force that could preserve her son's life, and thus the Romanov line itself. Was it love that drove her into the arms of prophets and healers? Or was it desperation that blinded her to the dangers of such reliance within the court? Her dependence on mystics only deepened mistrust. Ministers saw her as an interloper, courtiers as a manipulator, and the people as a symbol of foreign influence corrupting the throne. Yet Alexandra herself saw only the will of God working through chosen vessels. And so she clung to those who claimed divine vision. Letters between her and Nicholas reveal not merely affection, but prayers and prophecies, the language of rulers who believed their fate was bound to mysteries beyond human comprehension. To her, politics was secondary. The true struggle was spiritual, a battle between light and darkness for the survival of her family. But what if this very devotion, cloaked in sanctity, opened the dynasty to forces of deception, where mystics and charlatans could steer the empire through whispers in candlelit rooms? Isolation became Alexandra's constant companion. Distrusted by the nobility, resented by the people, and alienated by her foreign birth, she withdrew into a small circle of confidants, many of whom were chosen for their spiritual promise rather than political skill. She walked the palace corridors as though through a cloister, more nun than empress. Her life was consumed by prayer, ritual, and the desperate hope that miracles would descend upon her household. The further she withdrew into faith, the further she drifted from the practical world, until her image in the eyes of the empire was not of a queen, but of an enigma, a woman whose silence was filled with suspicion. The rift between Alexandra and the Russian people widened with every passing year. As famine struck and unrest grew, she was accused of indifference. Her retreats into private chapels were seen as arrogance rather than desperation. Rumors spread that she was a German agent, secretly guiding Russian policy toward betrayal during war. None of these rumors were substantiated. Yet in the fog of revolution, suspicion often carried more weight than truth. What greater irony could there be than a queen whose deepest fear was betrayal? yet whose very silence allowed betrayal to flourish in imagination. Her devotion to Nicholas was unwavering, and she urged him to rule with firmness, to resist reforms, to cling to the autocracy she believed was divinely ordained. Yet in doing so, she placed the dynasty further at odds with its people, ensuring that the walls around them grew higher and the isolation deeper. If Nicholas's weakness was indecision, Alexandra's was rigidity, an unyielding faith that sanctity could replace compromise, that destiny would triumph over doubt. Together they formed a paradoxical pair, a czar who could not decide and a czarina who refused to bend. A marriage that sealed not only their private lives, but also the fate of their empire. In her letters, she often wrote of visions and dreams, of unseen forces guiding events, of prophecies that promised salvation. These words reveal a woman who lived in a world where the boundaries between faith and fate had dissolved, where every event carried symbolic meaning. Every hardship was a divine test. To her, the dynasty's survival was not in the hands of armies or ministers, but in the hidden currents of providence. Yet providence, once invoked, also invited suspicion. Was Alexandra truly guided by divine insight, or was she a vessel for manipulation, her isolation exploited by those who claimed to speak with the voice of heaven? The czarina's isolation was more than a personal tragedy. It was a symbol of the dynasty's fate. Surrounded by grandeur, yet trapped in suspicion, Alexandra embodied the paradox of power that hides in silence. Her life reminds us that sometimes the greatest cover-up is not forged by enemies, but by rulers themselves, who cloak their despair in sanctity until truth itself vanishes behind veils of faith. And so the Romanov story deepens. For in Alexandra, we see not merely a queen, but a mirror of the dynasty's decline, devoted yet distrusted, faithful yet fragile, a figure both exalted and erased. Behind the veils of ritual and the isolation of Alexandra, the Romanov children lived lives that appeared gilded, yet were shadowed at every turn by fragility and foreboding. In portraits, they smile in uniforms and dresses, adorned with sashes and medals, embodiments of innocence framed by the trappings of empire. But within those portraits lies a silence. Their childhood was not carefree, but tightly bound by duty, secrecy, and the looming weight of a dynasty unraveling. The four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, were raised not simply as children, but as living symbols of orthodoxy and continuity. Their behavior was scrutinized by courtiers, their private lives reduced to fragments recorded in diaries that would later vanish or resurface in pieces altered by unseen hands. At the center of this fragile circle stood Alexei. Hemophilia was his inheritance, a curse that struck deep into the dynasty's sense of destiny. Even the smallest fall, a bruise, or a cut could become life-threatening, leaving the child bedridden for weeks, his body consumed by pain. For his sisters, childhood was defined by the constant shadow of his suffering, their games muted, their laughter subdued by the knowledge that their brother's body was always at risk of betraying him. Alexandra guarded him fiercely, drawing the family into deeper isolation, believing that faith and mysticism alone could shield him from the inevitable. What empire can endure when its future depends on the fragile body of a child whose very blood refuses to heal? The daughters, though less burdened by illness, were no less entwined in the fate of their lineage. They were groomed for marriages that might secure alliances. Yet revolution cut those plans short, leaving them trapped in limbo, neither free children nor sovereign figures. Within their diaries are glimpses of longing, laughter, and ordinary human affection. Yet these glimpses stand beside prayers that reveal how deeply the children were drawn into the mystical currents of their parents' world. They lived in a house where saints and omens were discussed more than politics, where holy men came and went in secrecy, and where their futures were shrouded in prophecies rather than promises. Life inside their world was paradoxical, luxurious in appearance yet confined in reality. They traveled between palaces filled with mirrors and icons surrounded by servants, yet they were increasingly cut off from society, guarded as though they were already prisoners before the revolution officially bound them. The children drew close to one another, forming bonds that became their only refuge as isolation deepened. Yet even those bonds could not shield them from the knowledge that they were being raised in a gilded cage, where freedom was measured by how tightly curtains were drawn and how carefully secrets were kept. Hemophilia was more than a medical condition. It became a metaphor for the dynasty itself. A single wound could unravel the future. A single hidden truth could bring down the facade of eternity. The Romanovs, like their heir, appeared strong in outward form, yet were internally fragile, bleeding invisibly from wounds that could never heal. And so the children, though innocent, bore in their bodies and lives the same paradox that haunted the entire dynasty: grandeur wrapped around vulnerability, sanctity entwined with secrecy, life shadowed by death. The people of Russia saw only fragments of their existence. Stories circulated of the princess's beauty, of their charity visits to hospitals, of Alexei's frailty, yet secrecy always accompanied these glimpses. Why were so few photographs permitted to show the boy in candid moments? Why were reports of his illness suppressed, denied, or rewritten if his condition was merely unfortunate? Why cloak it in silence? Unless the dynasty feared that the revelation of weakness would shatter the illusion of divine blessing, the children became symbols not of vitality, but of concealment. Their very existence was framed as part of a cover-up designed to preserve appearances. Even as revolution loomed, the Romanov children carried themselves with dignity beyond their years. In captivity, they wrote letters filled with hope, sketches of gardens and pets, fragments of ordinary youth. Yet beneath these fragile signs of life lay the unspoken truth. They were heirs to a world already dissolving, hostages of history whose voices would soon be silenced. Did they sense it? Did they hear the whispers in the corridors, the guarded conversations, the shifting tones of guards who once bowed but now muttered? Perhaps children feel such changes more deeply than adults, for innocence is not blind but often too perceptive, catching tremors that words refuse to name. The Romanov children thus embody the most poignant paradox of all. They were symbols of continuity, yet lived in a household collapsing inward. Faces of hope overshadowed by illness, laughter echoing in halls that were becoming prisons. Their fate reminds us that the cover-up of history is not only written in documents, but etched in silence, in missing diaries, not in stories told too late, in graves discovered too shallow or too empty. What remains of their voices now are fragments scattered through archives, fragments that never complete the picture, leaving us to wonder whether the greatest silence of the Romanovs is not their execution, but the vanishing of the childhood that history itself refused to preserve. And so their presence lingers in portraits that stare back at us with eyes that seem too knowing. In legends that whisper of survival, in unanswered questions that persist across generations. Were they merely children caught in the tides of history? Or were they, like their parents, woven into a design of concealment where innocence itself became part of the cover-up? Into this circle of fragility stepped a figure whose very name would come to embody both salvation and suspicion. Grigory Rasputin, the wandering mystic from Siberia, cast his shadow across the Romanov dynasty like a specter too strange to be dismissed. He was a peasant by birth, a wanderer by inclination, a man who claimed visions and healings, yet carried with him the scent of scandal. His arrival in the Romanov story seems improbable, almost absurd. Yet it is precisely this improbability that deepens the sense of enigma. How could the fate of an empire, its continuity and its collapse, hinge upon the presence of a single mystic whose life was steeped in contradictions? Rasputin's bond with the Romanovs began through Alexei, the frail heir whose bleeding disorder defied both physicians and prayers. In moments of crisis, when the boy writhed in agony and death seemed near, Rasputin's interventions appeared miraculous. He prayed, whispered, commanded rest, and somehow the bleeding slowed. The pain eased. The boy survived, Whether through hypnotic influence, intuition, or sheer coincidence, these moments convinced Alexandra that Rasputin was chosen by God to protect her son and, by extension, the dynasty itself. From that moment, her devotion to him was unshakable, a faith so absolute that it eclipsed the suspicions of courtiers and ministers alike. Was Rasputin a healer or a manipulator, a prophet or an opportunist? The truth remains veiled in conflicting testimonies, but his presence became inseparable from the family's fate. At court, his influence ignited fury. Ministers whispered of corruption, nobles of scandal, and priests of heresy. Rasputin's reputation was stained by stories of excess, drunkenness, and liaisons with women drawn to his magnetic presence. Whether exaggerated or true, these rumors became weapons used to depict the dynasty as corrupted by a peasant sorcerer. And yet Nicholas and Alexandra clung to him, believing that his prayers held power greater than armies. What cover-up could be deeper than this? An empire presenting itself as sanctified and eternal while privately entrusting its future to the whispered words of a wandering mystic. Rasputin himself seemed aware of his role. He wrote letters to the Tsarina filled with divine pronouncements, signing them with the authority of a chosen man. His handwriting, crude yet commanding, carried weight beyond its form. For Alexandra read them as scripture, Nicholas as guidance, and the dynasty as lifeline. To their enemies, these letters were evidence of manipulation. To the family, they were proof of providence, which was truth and which was illusion, perhaps both at once. For Rasputin embodied contradictions, saint to some, demon to others, yet always a figure who destabilized the fragile balance of the throne. Attempts to remove him only strengthened the enigma. Priests denounced him, nobles plotted against him, ministers begged Nicholas to send him away. Yet Rasputin remained. Each crisis in Alexei's health reinforced his indispensability. Was it coincidence that the boy's bleeding eased in his presence? Or was there a deeper force at work, one that science could not explain? Some whispered that he used hypnosis. Others claimed that his calm presence allowed Alexandra to soothe her son, which in turn eased his suffering. But what if it was neither psychology nor coincidence, but something stranger, something that defied explanation and bound the dynasty to a mystic precisely because his power could not be understood? His assassination in 1916 only deepened the mystery. Poisoned, shot, beaten, drowned, the legends of his death are as contradictory as the stories of his life. He seemed impossible to kill, rising again after each attempt until finally silence claimed him. Yet even then his prophecy lingered, that if he were killed by nobles, the Romanov dynasty would fall within 2 years. Less than 2 years later, the family was dead. The empire dissolved, the dynasty erased. Was this prophecy coincidence, manipulation, or knowledge of a destiny already scripted? And if it was scripted, who were the true authors? Rasputin, fate, or unseen hands guiding both? The presence of Rasputin forces us to confront the paradox of the Romanovs' final years. An empire of unimaginable scale with armies, ministries, and wealth beyond measure placed its faith not in generals or statesmen, but in a peasant mystic whose powers remain inexplicable. What does this reveal about the dynasty's state of mind, or about the nature of power itself? Perhaps that power, when fragile, turns to mystery, and that mystery, when embraced, becomes indistinguishable from manipulation. Rasputin's shadow is not only his own, but also the reflection of the Romanovs' desperation, their belief that salvation lay not in politics, but in secrets too dangerous to name. Thus, Rasputin endures as a symbol of the dynasty's contradictions. He was both savior and destroyer, healer and corrupter, miracle and scandal. His presence in the Romanov story is less a chapter than a wound, a reminder that history often turns not on armies or treaties, but on figures who seem improbable, even absurd, yet whose shadows stretch across empires. And in the silence that follows his death, we are left with the lingering question, did Rasputin save the Romanovs for a time, or did he ensure that when they fell, they would fall into the deepest silence of all? Long before the cellar in Yekaterinburg and the silence that swallowed a dynasty, An omen had already cast its shadow over Nicholas II's reign, etched not in secret correspondence, but in public blood. At his coronation in 1896, the new Tsar was meant to embody the eternal continuity of Russia, a ruler sanctified by the church and celebrated by the people. The ceremony itself unfolded with grandeur. Incense drifted through the air of the Kremlin, chants of priests echoed like the voice of heaven. Yet outside, on the Kodinka field where gifts were to be distributed to the masses, the crowd surged with such force that chaos turned to carnage. Bridges collapsed, bodies were crushed, and over 1,000 souls perished in a frenzy of desperation. It was meant to be a day of promise. Instead, it became a day of death, a prophecy written not in scripture, but in blood-soaked earth. The contradiction could not be ignored. How could the reign of a supposedly divinely chosen ruler begin with such calamity for the people? Whispers of curse and omen spread like wildfire. To foreign observers, it confirmed the fragility of a dynasty out of step with its own subjects. Yet, Nicholas proceeded with the coronation ball at the French embassy that very evening, a decision that cast him forever as indifferent, even heartless, in the eyes of many. Was this callousness, or was it the paralysis of a man bound by ritual, incapable of breaking the sacred rhythm of ceremony? Even when confronted with horror, the truth was lost in silence. But the image endured while the dead lay unburied. The Tsar danced beneath chandeliers. The Kodinka tragedy became more than an accident. It became a lens through which the entire reign was interpreted. Every crisis thereafter seemed to carry its echo, as if fate had already delivered its judgment. The Russo-Japanese War, with its humiliating defeats, was seen not merely as mismanagement, but as the fulfillment of the curse. The massacre of peaceful demonstrators on Bloody Sunday in 1905 was not only a political disaster, but a continuation of Kodinka's prophecy. Each failure fed the belief that Nicholas was marked by doom, that his dynasty was cursed from the start. What ruler can govern when the very air of his reign is filled with whispers of destiny already sealed? The Romanovs themselves could not have ignored the symbolism. Alexandra, steeped in mysticism, surely interpreted Kodinka as more than an accident. Rasputin, years later, may have exploited its shadow to reinforce his role as spiritual guardian. Even Nicholas, though outwardly stoic, recorded in his diary words that revealed unease, a sense that his reign was born under a black star. Was the tragedy truly coincidence? Or was it a warning, a staged spectacle of fate designed to brand the dynasty as doomed in the eyes of its people? When thousands die in celebration of eternity, is it not as though eternity itself is mocking the claim? The imagery of Kodinka is haunting. Fields of discarded shoes, ribbons trampled into mud. Gifts meant for joy became relics of horror. Survivors spoke of bodies stacked like firewood, of the eerie silence that followed the screams. In the aftermath, the imperial family distributed aid and donations, but the gesture could not erase the memory. The people saw not charity, but guilt, not compassion, but desperation to rewrite the narrative. History, however, remembers omens more vividly than compensations, and Kodinka remained etched into collective memory as the true beginning of the end. Legends grew around the tragedy. Some claimed that prophecies had long foretold blood at a coronation, that the land itself rejected Nicholas's crown. Others whispered of sabotage, that enemies of the dynasty had deliberately created panic to taint the reign from its start. No definitive answers exist, for official records downplayed the horror, reducing the number of dead, softening the language, concealing the full scale. Was this one of the first cover-ups of the Romanovs' final era? An attempt to erase not only bodies but destiny itself? If so, the attempt failed, for the silence only amplified suspicion that something darker was at work. The paradox of Kodinka is that it was both accident and prophecy, both event and symbol. It revealed the vulnerability of a dynasty dependent on spectacle to project eternity. Yet it also became the first in a chain of disasters that seemed to confirm whispers of a curse. From that day forward, Nicholas II ruled not only as emperor, but as a man shadowed by fate. His every act was interpreted through the lens of a tragedy he could never erase. The crown sat upon his head, yet beneath it lay the weight of 1,000 deaths pressing into memory, a silent prophecy that no ritual could cleanse. Thus, the Romanov story carries within it a cruel irony. The empire that cloaked itself in divine sanctity could not escape the blood-soaked omen of its beginning. And so the question lingers unresolved, echoing through time. Was the Kodinka tragedy merely a coincidence of crowds, or was it the first unveiling of a cover-up far greater? A destiny already written, one the dynasty could never outrun. From the cursed soil of Kodinka Field, the dynasty marched into wars that would consume not only armies, but the very illusion of permanence on which the Romanovs had built their throne. The empire, vast in territory yet brittle in spirit, found itself hurled against adversaries that revealed its weakness more ruthlessly than any domestic uprising. The first great wound came with the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, a conflict Nicholas believed would be swift and glorious, a chance to reaffirm Russia's prestige as guardian of the East. Instead, the war unfolded as humiliation. Russian fleets sunk in distant seas, soldiers ill-equipped and poorly led, and a supposedly eternal empire defeated by a nation the European courts had dismissed as peripheral. To the people, it was not merely a military disaster, but a revelation that their rulers were fallible, their empire vulnerable, their destiny far from secure. Defeat shattered illusions of divine favor. If the Tsar ruled by God's mandate, why had God allowed Russia to fall before Japan? Priests urged faith, ministers crafted excuses, but whispers of doom spread deeper into villages and barracks. The dynasty responded with repression. Yet every execution, every exile, only widened the chasm between ruler and ruled. The war meant to solidify authority, instead loosened the bonds of loyalty, turning reverence into resentment. What if this war was not miscalculation, but necessity? A stage in which weakness had to be revealed, where the empire's vulnerability was laid bare to prepare the way for its erasure. The unrest that followed became known as the Revolution of 1905, a movement born not only from political agitation, but from the despair of soldiers and peasants who no longer saw eternity in the Tsar's crown. On a frigid January morning, crowds of demonstrators marched peacefully toward the Winter Palace, carrying icons and petitions rather than weapons. They sought protection from the Little Father, pleading for relief from hunger, poverty, and injustice. Instead, they were met with gunfire, soldiers opening fire on unarmed citizens, their bodies collapsing in snow stained red. History remembers it as Bloody Sunday, a massacre that forever shattered the sacred image of the Tsar as father of his people. The bond between dynasty and nation was severed not by whispers, but by bullets. Nicholas, already haunted by Kodinka, now carried another omen carved into his reign. If coronation blood had foreshadowed doom, Bloody Sunday confirmed it. His diaries spoke of sorrow, yet he refused to concede responsibility, framing the event as misfortune rather than crime. But to the people, the cover-up was transparent, for truth bled too openly in the streets to be hidden by words. What can be concealed when thousands carry the memory of gunfire in their bodies, their families, their very breath? The empire's attempt to rewrite the narrative only deepened suspicion, convincing many that the dynasty would suppress not only dissent, but truth itself. Years later, as Europe descended into the abyss of the First World War, the Romanovs clung to the illusion that sacrifice might cleanse failure. Nicholas donned uniforms, reviewed troops, and proclaimed destiny's call. Yet the war became another crucible of ruin, with millions of Russian soldiers falling in mud and snow. Their deaths piled like stones upon the dynasty's already collapsing foundation. Soldiers deserted, peasants starved, ministers schemed, and still Nicholas insisted on leading the army himself, abandoning government to Alexandra and her circle. The empire's body bled as surely as Alexei's fragile veins, and no healer could stem the flow. The paradox was stark. Wars were meant to display power, yet each conflict stripped the dynasty bare. Victories that should have secured loyalty instead exposed incompetence. Defeats that should have humbled instead invited repression. The Romanovs appeared less as rulers chosen by God than as prisoners of fate, trapped in a cycle where every attempt to assert authority only deepened decay. Was it merely misfortune, or was it deliberate orchestration, a design ensuring that each step toward glory would unravel into catastrophe? If so, who wrote this design? Chance, destiny, or hands concealed in the fog of history? The empire's decline through war was not measured only on battlefields, but in memory. Each disaster left scars that could not be erased. Scars carried in songs and whispers and silences at village tables. The people no longer saw eternity in the crown, but fragility, a dynasty cursed by omens and confirmed by failure. Yet official histories would later minimize these scars, recasting defeats as struggles, downplaying massacres, omitting whispers. Was this rewriting merely the work of later regimes, or did the cover-up begin even in Nicholas's time, when truth itself became a casualty of the dynasty's survival? Thus, the wars of the Romanovs are more than history. They are symbols of an empire unraveling from within. Each battle lost was not only territory or prestige, but a fragment of memory, erased, rewritten, or silenced. And so the dynasty staggered onward, bleeding invisibly like its heir, carrying within its body wounds no ritual could cleanse. What dynasty can endure when war becomes not the defense of empire, but the revelation of its fragility? And if wars expose truth, how much of that truth has been concealed, buried, or rewritten to protect the illusion that the Romanovs still stood as eternal guardians of Russia's fate? As the empire bled on the battlefields of the Russo-Japanese War and then the First World War, Nicholas II clung to the throne with a desperation that revealed more fragility than strength. He believed, perhaps with sincerity, that surrendering authority would unravel Russia entirely. Yet every decision he made seemed to hasten that unraveling. The paradox deepened when he chose to assume direct command of the army in 1915, leaving his capital behind and entrusting governance to Alexandra and the circle of mystics who surrounded her. By stepping into the uniform of Supreme Commander, Nicholas sought to embody the image of a warrior czar. Yet instead, he became personally tied to every defeat, every casualty, every retreat into the endless snows of the Eastern Front. The crown he wore became indistinguishable from the burden of failure. The empire beneath him fractured further. Workers in cities struck, peasants in villages grew restless, soldiers at the front deserted in staggering numbers. Each failure at war was matched by famine at home, each shortage of bread by whispers of conspiracy. And within these whispers, another suspicion arose, that forces beyond Russia's borders were weaving the empire's collapse, pulling strings that the dynasty could not see or dared not acknowledge. For the war was not merely between nations, but between kin. Nicholas locked in battle against Germany, a nation ruled by his cousin Wilhelm, while Britain, led by his cousin George, stood as ally in name but distant in action. How strange that an empire should dissolve in a war where monarchs of shared blood ordered their people to slaughter one another. Was this truly coincidence, or was it part of a darker design? Foreign powers circled like vultures over Russia's weakening body. Britain and France pressed for sacrifices that bled the Russian army dry, while whispers spread that German agents stirred unrest behind the lines. Some even claimed that Alexandra herself, with her German birth and her devotion to mystics, acted as a conduit for influence from Berlin, though no evidence ever proved such charges. Yet in times of collapse, perception matters more than truth, and perception declared that the dynasty was compromised, perhaps even betrayed from within. Was Alexandra a victim of rumor, or was she used as a pawn in a larger game where silence served foreign interests as well as domestic rebels? Western complicity in the Romanovs' fall reveals itself not through direct declarations, but through silences too well-timed to ignore. When the dynasty sought refuge, Britain offered asylum only to retract it under pressure of political consequence. Why would King George, cousin and mirror of Nicholas, deny sanctuary to family unless secrecy demanded it? Why did France, once so dependent on Russian blood to bolster its front, fall silent when that bloodline faced extinction? The answers remain sealed in archives, fragments of correspondence edited, redacted, or locked away. Silence once again became the greater revelation, not what was spoken, but what was withheld. Even in America, observers noted with curiosity how quickly recognition shifted from Tsarist allies to revolutionary forces once the dynasty fell. Within months, the Romanovs, who had been portrayed as bulwarks of civilization, vanished from sympathetic memory, their fate reduced to whispers. Could it be that their erasure was too convenient, their absence too smoothly absorbed into the narrative of progress? When great dynasties vanish, history usually trembles. Yet here it seemed to sigh with relief, as though the disappearance was less tragedy than resolution. Who resolved it, and why, remains the unspoken question. If Western powers were complicit, their motives may have been simple: to prevent instability from spilling across borders, to secure alliances unencumbered by a faltering dynasty, to silence a family whose blood tied too many courts together. For in the Romanovs lay a genealogy that connected thrones across Europe, and perhaps to allow their survival would have been to risk revelations of secrets that stretched beyond Russia. Was it safer then to let silence close upon them, to permit their erasure rather than risk their testimony? Nicholas, meanwhile, continued to cling to power as though denial could repel destiny. His decrees grew weaker, his commands less obeyed. His very presence in Petrograd reduced to rumor. Ministers resigned, generals lost faith, and still he insisted that autocracy could endure, that divine right could shield him from the tidal wave. But divine right, once invoked as shield, had become the very evidence of his blindness. If God had chosen him, why did God abandon his armies, starve his people, silence his allies? And if God had not abandoned him, what power had intervened to ensure his collapse? Thus, the Romanovs entered the twilight of their rule. Not only were they besieged by revolutionaries, but they were also isolated by silence abroad. Their cousins in Europe did not intervene. Their allies turned away, and their enemies pressed harder. The dynasty was left to face not merely the wrath of its people, but also the indifference of the world, a silence as chilling as the Siberian winds that would soon swallow them. Was this silence orchestrated? A cover-up designed to erase a family too entangled in Europe's bloodlines, too dangerous to leave alive? Or was it merely the natural outcome of a world ready to bury the past and move on? In this paradox lies the Romanovs' final tragedy. A dynasty that claimed eternity was abandoned by those bound to it by blood, silenced by those who once proclaimed it essential. And in that silence, we glimpse the possibility of complicity. For sometimes the loudest betrayal is not action, but the refusal to act. As Russia's empire fractured and its allies fell silent, another silence loomed larger than all others. One deeper, older, and more impenetrable: the silence of the Vatican. For centuries, the papal archives have gathered the documents of empires and the secrets of dynasties, their shelves stretching like endless corridors of memory, guarded with a vigilance that rivals any fortress. When the Romanovs fell, whispers spread that letters had passed between Nicholas the Meek and the Vatican, that appeals for mediation, recognition, or spiritual counsel were made and perhaps answered. Yet these letters never surfaced in daylight, confined instead to vaults where truth is preserved not for revelation, but for concealment. Why would a church that claims universality and mercy remain silent when a family sanctified in their own tradition faced extinction? The relationship between Rome and the Romanovs was never simple. The Russian dynasty was bound to orthodoxy, their legitimacy inseparable from its rituals and liturgies, while the Vatican represented a rival claim to universal authority. Yet history records instances of contact, diplomatic exchanges, and even whispered negotiations. Some claim that Nicholas, desperate for allies as war unraveled his empire, sought recognition from Rome, hoping that spiritual solidarity might translate into political rescue. Others suggested that the Vatican, aware of prophecies surrounding the collapse of monarchies, preferred silence, choosing not to intervene so that destiny could unfold unchallenged, which was truth, which was rumor, and which was deliberate misdirection placed to obscure deeper currents. Legends grew of letters locked away in Vatican vaults, correspondence that revealed more than politics. Some whispered that the Romanovs had shared with the Vatican certain relics, icons, or esoteric writings inherited through centuries, perhaps fragments of ancient knowledge preserved in the shadow of orthodoxy. If so, then their destruction was not merely political, but spiritual, a cleansing of memory designed to keep dangerous truths from resurfacing. The Vatican's silence then becomes more than indifference. It becomes complicity, for what is withheld shapes history as powerfully as what is spoken. The paradox of the Vatican's silence is sharpened by its timing. In 1917, as revolution consumed Russia, the papacy issued statements lamenting war and human suffering, yet not a word was spoken in specific defense of the Romanovs. Even after their execution in 1918, the Church spoke in generalities of martyrdom and violence, never naming the dynasty, never demanding answers. Why omit names when names are the essence of prayer and memory? Was it caution, diplomacy, or deliberate erasure, as though acknowledging the Romanovs would draw attention to truths too unsettling to confront? Consider also the role of Catholic monarchies tied by blood to the Romanovs. Austria, Hungary, Spain, and France had kinship ties that should have compelled outrage, yet their courts echoed the Vatican's silence. Some scholars suggest this was political necessity, a desire not to antagonize revolutionary Russia or its allies. But what if it was something else? An agreement of silence, a pact across thrones and altars to bury not only a dynasty, but also the secrets too entwined with it. If the archives were opened, would we find traces of forbidden alliances, unspoken compromises, or even prophecies too dangerous to confirm? The Vatican archives remain among the most impenetrable of human institutions. Scholars who request access are often denied or granted only fragments carefully curated and sanitized of revelation. It is said that corridors extend for miles, filled with manuscripts that could rewrite the very story of Europe. If the Romanovs' fate is recorded there, then perhaps the truth of their erasure lies not in Siberia's soil, but in Rome's silence. What if the darkest cover-up is not the cellar where the family died, but the vault where their story remains locked, awaiting eyes that may never see? And yet, silence itself is testimony. The refusal to speak, the absence of names, the guarded vaults, all suggest that the Romanovs' end was not merely a Russian tragedy, but a European one, a chapter deliberately obscured to protect a larger narrative of power. What was so dangerous about this family that even the Vatican, guardian of secrets stretching back to antiquity, chose to bury their memory in silence? Were the Romanovs custodians of knowledge that transcended politics, knowledge whose revelation could destabilize the very foundations of both faith and empire? Thus, the Vatican stands as both witness and participant in the Romanov mystery. Its silence is too complete to be accidental, too consistent to be coincidence. Whether it was indifference, complicity, or guardianship of truths we cannot yet imagine, the effect is the same, a cover-up that stretches across faiths and centuries, leaving us to wonder not only what was hidden, but why. If truth is light, then perhaps some truths burn too brightly, and so they are confined to vaults where only shadows may touch them. The Romanovs vanish in Siberia, yet echoes of their story linger in archives beneath Rome. What greater paradox could there be than a dynasty sanctified in orthodoxy, whose fate may be preserved or concealed in the very heart of its rival faith? And so the question remains, unanswered and unresolved. Is the Vatican's silence an act of forgetting, or is it the most deliberate remembrance of all? Beyond the Vatican's sealed corridors, another thread of silence weaves through the Romanov story. The voices of those who fled, who lived to tell fragments, yet never the whole tale. In the years following the cellar at Ekaterinburg, émigrés scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, carrying with them stories, photographs, jewels, and memories that became both testimony and rumor. Among them were aristocrats who claimed to have witnessed the family's captivity, servants who insisted they had seen survivors, and pretenders who bore uncanny resemblances or details that could not be easily dismissed. Out of these whispers emerged the haunting possibility that not all Romanovs perished in that cellar, that some fragment of the dynasty survived, hidden, disguised, or deliberately concealed. The first wave of survivor accounts emerged in Paris and Berlin, cities that became gathering places for Russian émigrés. Cafes filled with exiles spoke in hushed tones of Anastasia escaping through secret doors, of Alexei spirited away by loyal guards, of daughters smuggled to convents where silence could preserve their lives. Most historians dismiss these as wishful inventions, the desperate dreams of a dispossessed aristocracy clinging to fragments of hope. Yet hope alone does not explain the persistence of detailed descriptions. Secret tunnels beneath the Ipatiev house, trucks carrying away bodies too few in number, guards who spoke of orders that did not align with official accounts. Was this the birth of myth, or was it the remnant of truth carefully disguised as fantasy? The most famous of these figures was Anna Anderson, a woman who emerged in Germany claiming to be Anastasia. Her story captivated Europe for decades, fueled by mannerisms and knowledge that seemed impossible for an imposter. Though DNA evidence in the late 20th century discredited her claim, the very endurance of her legend reveals how deeply the possibility of survival haunted the collective imagination. If her claim was false, why did so many who knew the Romanovs believe her? If her claim was true, why did history labor so fiercely to deny it? Other claimants arose, less famous but equally enigmatic men who claimed to be Alex and women who claimed to be Maria or Tatiana, each with fragments of memory, scars, or relics. Most were dismissed as frauds, yet some carried details that defied easy explanation. One supposed Alexei spoke of a specific icon in the palace chapel, a detail not publicly known. Another described the layout of private rooms in Tsarskoye Selo with uncanny accuracy. Were these coincidences or echoes of truth buried beneath layers of denial? The cover-up may not have been erasure alone, but substitution, a deliberate seeding of imposters to drown real survivors in a sea of fraud. Among émigrés, whispers also persisted of foreign involvement. Some claimed the British Secret Services had smuggled one or more of the daughters to safety, fearful of Bolshevik retribution but unwilling to admit intervention. Others whispered that Germany had extracted a surviving Romanov as a bargaining chip, a living relic to be used in negotiations never revealed. None of these claims were substantiated. Yet their very abundance suggests more than fantasy. Why would so many stories converge on the idea of survival unless there was at least a shadow of truth? The Soviet regime, for its part, cultivated silence for decades. It offered no details of the execution, no graves, no photographs, only denials and diversions. In this void, the possibility of survival flourished, nourished by secrecy. If the state had nothing to hide, why conceal the fate of a dynasty already dead? What greater cover-up could there be than silence so complete it allowed rumors to become more powerful than facts? The émigré community lived with this paradox. They mourned the dynasty, yet whispered of its survival. They buried icons of the Tsar, yet lit candles for daughters they believed might still breathe somewhere in Europe. In exiled churches, prayers named the Romanovs as martyrs, while others muttered that martyrs do not hide in convents. The duality remains. Was survival a comforting myth, or a truth buried beneath layers of deception and silence? What endures is the sense of an unfinished story. The Romanovs' supposed extinction is framed as certainty, yet whispers of survivors gnaw at that certainty, refusing to die. Even in the 21st century, discoveries of remains in shallow graves only partially silence speculation. For some bodies were missing, identities disputed, DNA contested. The émigrés may be gone, but their whispers remain like echoes in a cavern, reminding us that silence is not absence but concealment. Thus, the forgotten survivors, real or imagined, are part of the cover-up. Their stories blur the line between truth and invention, hope and manipulation. If some did survive, their erasure was deliberate, hidden to preserve the narrative of total annihilation. And if none survived, then why does the suspicion of survival endure so powerfully across generations? Perhaps because the Romanov story was never allowed to end with clarity, but only with silence, contradiction, and doubt. And so the question persists. Did the dynasty truly vanish in a cellar of bullets and bayonets, or did fragments slip through the cracks of history, carried in whispers across borders, preserved in silence more potent than memory? The most enduring figure among the pretenders was not a noble émigré claimant, but a woman who surfaced in the shadows of Berlin during the 1920s. She was first called Fräulein Unbekannt, then Anna Anderson, and finally Anastasia to those who wished to believe. Her tale, whispered in hospital wards and repeated in drawing rooms, grew into a legend that rivaled the official history of the dynasty's demise. She bore scars, she spoke of private details, she displayed mannerisms that some swore belonged to the youngest Romanov daughter. To the exiled nobility, starved for hope and haunted by guilt, she became more than a woman. She became the possibility that the cover-up was incomplete, that survival had occurred and that truth remained hidden. Anna Anderson's story spread across Europe like fog, elusive and intoxicating. Those who met her described eyes that seemed both weary and piercing, a voice that carried the cadence of memory, and a refusal to be silenced. She remembered the layout of palace rooms, the names of servants long dead, the peculiar habits of sisters who should have been lost in shallow graves. Skeptics argued that she had studied, that she had been fed information by sympathetic émigrés, yet some of her knowledge was so precise, so intimate, that even hardened doubters hesitated. If she was not Anastasia, how did she know the secrets of a family buried in silence? The legend of Anna Anderson reveals as much about the hunger for mystery as it does about truth. Courts and tribunals examined her claims. Handwriting experts compared letters. Relatives confronted her with suspicion and hope. Decades passed. Fortunes were spent. Reputations ruined. Yet no final verdict satisfied all. Her story was not merely personal, but symbolic. A battle between two narratives. The official silence of Soviet Russia, which insisted that all Romanovs had perished, and the persistent hope of émigrés, for whom Anastasia's supposed survival spoke to a deeper wound. A dynasty cannot be erased in an instant without leaving a scar, and that scar often takes the shape of legend. For those who had lost everything, homes, wealth, status, identity, the idea that one Romanov had survived became a way to believe that their own exile was not in vain, that continuity still existed somewhere, hidden in the shadows. In the shadows. Was Anastasia the symbol of their own survival, a living emblem of a world erased yet not entirely gone? DNA testing in the late 20th century discredited Anna Anderson's claim, linking her instead to a Polish factory worker. Science closed the case, yet suspicion remained. If the Romanovs' bodies had not all been found, if graves remained incomplete, could science itself be part of the cover-up, used to bury once again a mystery that had refused to die? How often has history invoked evidence only to silence questions rather than answer them? And why does the story of Anastasia endure, retold in novels, films, and whispered conversations, if not because it resonates with something deeper than fact? Other pretenders arose, less famous but equally haunting. Some claimed to be Maria, others Tatiana, still others Alexei. Most were quickly dismissed. Yet their proliferation raises its own question. Why so many, and why so persistent? Was it fraud born of desperation, or was it the deliberate seeding of false claimants to obscure the possibility of true survival? To flood the world with imposters is to ensure that truth, even if it surfaces, will be drowned in noise. If this was the design, it succeeded. For history now regards all claimants as suspect, and suspicion itself becomes the cover-up. The image of Anastasia, whether living or imagined, haunts the Romanovs' story precisely because it refuses to vanish. The cellar at Ekaterinburg was meant to end the dynasty with finality, yet the figure of the lost princess disrupts that finality, insisting on ambiguity. A family supposedly erased returns as shadow, a ghost wearing the face of survival. Whether real or imagined, that ghost exposes the fragility of official history, reminding us that erasure is never complete. Perhaps the true significance of Anna Anderson and the other pretenders is not whether they were Romanovs, but that their existence reveals humanity's hunger to resist silence. When history ends too abruptly, legends emerge to fill the void, legends that may conceal as much as they reveal. Imposters become part of the cover-up, whether intentional or not, because they ensure that truth remains obscured, hidden within a fog too dense to pierce. Thus, the mask of Anastasia endures, a mask worn by imposters, by legends, by memory itself. Behind it lies either survival or myth, truth or fabrication. Yet in every version, the effect is the same. The Romanovs refuse to vanish cleanly. The dynasty's ghost lingers not only in graves and archives, but also in faces that rise from the crowd, in voices that claim to remember, in stories that refuse to die. What if that is the final cover-up? Not erasure, but endless substitution, where shadows replace bodies, legends replace lives, and truth is forever deferred. If imposters and pretenders haunted the public imagination, the silence of the actual Romanov children echoes far more deeply, for theirs are the voices that never had the chance to speak. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei were raised not only as heirs but as symbols. Their lives were reduced to fragments in diaries and photographs. Their destinies collapsed into the sale of bullets. History tells us of their innocence, their devotion to family, their quiet service as nurses during the war. Yet history cannot reveal what they might have said if allowed to live, nor what secrets they carried within the silence imposed upon them. The daughters were not merely ornaments of the dynasty. Each possessed personality, wit, and depth, glimpsed in diaries but never fully revealed. Olga, thoughtful and often melancholy, wrote of dreams and doubts. Tatiana, disciplined and authoritative, acted as a second mother to her siblings. Maria, gentle and affectionate, longed for connection. Anastasia, mischievous and spirited, laughed in defiance of solemnity. Together, they formed a chorus of voices that humanized the dynasty. Yet together, they were silenced in a single night. What empire fears the laughter of daughters so much that it ensures they will never grow to speak their own truths? Alexei, fragile heir, embodied both hope and despair. His illness confined him, yet he remained the pivot of the dynasty's survival. Every step, every fall carried consequences for the empire, for his body was the mirror of Russia itself, seemingly robust yet secretly bleeding. The silence surrounding him was not only medical, but political. The dynasty concealed his condition, terrified that revelation would weaken the image of divine protection. And so his suffering became private, his cries muffled by curtains, his fragility hidden behind portraits that showed only dignity. If his voice had been allowed to reach the people, would they have seen not a divine curse but shared humanity? Or was the concealment itself part of the cover-up, ensuring that fragility would never tarnish the illusion of eternity? In captivity, their silence grew heavier. Letters smuggled from Tobolsk and Ekaterinburg reveal fragments of faith, routine, and quiet courage. Yet the true weight of their voices is missing. Guards recorded their movements, but not their conversations. Diaries end abruptly. Words trail into silence. Did they discuss escape? Did they share prophecies? Did they sense betrayal even from those meant to protect them? History does not say, for history was rewritten, diaries destroyed, testimonies censored. The silence of the children is not absence, but erasure. Legends of their final hours differ. Some accounts claim they sang hymns as bullets rained, others that screams drowned prayers. Some speak of bayonets when bullets failed, others of smoke and chaos. The very inconsistency of these accounts is itself a cover-up. For when truth is scattered into fragments, certainty dissolves into fog. Did the children suffer longer than reported? Did some survive the initial volleys? Were their bodies concealed to protect the illusion of total annihilation? Each version contradicts the next, ensuring that silence reigns where clarity should stand. What makes their silence most haunting is that it was unnecessary. The children held no political office, commanded no armies, plotted no revolutions. Their erasure was not pragmatic, but symbolic, a ritual destruction of continuity, an obliteration of innocence meant to ensure that memory itself could not survive. And yet, memory endured, for their absence became more powerful than their presence. The very fact that they were denied voices ensures that generations have strained to hear them, reconstructing fragments from whispers, imagining words never spoken. Consider the paradox of silencing the children. Their executioners ensured their immortality. The Romanov daughters became symbols of lost innocence. Alex, a symbol of fragility destroyed by violence, stands as a reminder that their silence is louder than their voices could ever have been, echoing across history as proof of how ruthlessly power can erase. Yet that erasure is incomplete, for the cover-up carries cracks, and through those cracks escape rumors of survival, imposters claiming their names, and legends refusing to die. The attempt to extinguish their voices instead created a chorus of ghosts, each echoing questions that will never find answers. What remains is a haunting absence, an emptiness at the heart of the Romanov story. The children never grew to reveal themselves, and so they remain eternal in memory, frozen in photographs, immortalized in speculation. Enshrined as martyrs by some, as mysteries by others, they embody a silence that may be the darkest cover-up of all, for it denied not only truth, but the very possibility of truth, leaving us forever to wonder what they might have said, what they might have revealed had history not been rewritten with bullets. Thus their silence endures. It is a silence not quiet but accusatory, pressing against the walls of archives, haunting the dreams of historians, unsettling every attempt at closure. The dynasty's cover-up lies not only in missing documents or buried bodies, but in the unspoken voices of children who were never allowed to grow, who remain forever suspended in the night of their erasure. And so we ask, with no answer to follow, when voices are silenced before they can speak, does history belong to those who wield power? Or does it belong to the silence itself, which outlasts every attempt to erase? The silence of the children leads us inevitably to the place where that silence was enforced, the house in Ekaterinburg that became both prison and tomb. The Ipayev house, later remembered only as the House of Special Purpose, stood on a quiet street, its walls plain, its exterior unremarkable. Yet within those walls unfolded one of history's most chilling enigmas, a captivity that seemed less like confinement and more like ritual unfolding step by step. Guards patrolled corridors, windows were painted over, and even the garden where the family once walked was reduced to a narrow enclosure watched by rifles. The Romanovs lived under constant surveillance, their existence shrinking daily until even light and sound were rationed. Their final months were filled with contradictions that history has never fully resolved. Some accounts describe guards who treated them with respect, even sympathy, sneaking small comforts into their cells. Others tell of cruelty, humiliation, and theft, of jewels stolen, food withheld, prayers mocked. The truth lies fragmented, scattered across depositions taken years later, many altered or destroyed. In this fog of testimony, one detail remains constant. The house itself was more than a prison. It was a stage set for disappearance. It became the place where the dynasty's fate was sealed, not only in blood but in secrecy. Rumors swirl of tunnels beneath the house, of passages that allowed unseen movement. Some claim that trucks arrived at night carrying crates whose contents were never revealed. Others insist the guards themselves were divided, some whispering of survival, others of total annihilation. Official records insist that all were executed in the cellar on a single night in July 1918. Yet inconsistencies remain. The number of bodies, the caliber of bullets, even the very descriptions of the execution differ from witness to witness. How can one event produce so many conflicting versions unless the confusion itself was part of the design? The cellar has become infamous, yet even here contradictions abound. Some accounts describe the family being told they were to be photographed, gathered in the basement under the pretense of relocation. Others insist they were read a decree of execution before gunfire erupted. Some recall the family dying instantly. Others say bayonets were used when bullets failed. The walls themselves seem to absorb the chaos, later scrubbed, repainted, and eventually destroyed when the Soviet regime ordered the house razed to prevent it from becoming a shrine. What greater sign of a cover-up than the destruction of the very building where history turned to silence? When investigators later examined the site, they found fragments of bone, blood stains, and bullet holes. Yet even these traces contradicted official reports. Some claimed the remains were incomplete, that not every body could be accounted for. Others suggested fire and acid had been used to obliterate evidence. Why such excessive measures if the goal was merely execution? Was the intention not only to kill but to erase, to ensure that memory itself could not be pieced together? In erasure lies concealment, and in concealment lies power. The house, stripped of ornament, became the dynasty's final palace. Its bare walls replaced gilded halls, its guarded corridors replaced ballrooms. The Romanovs, once surrounded by mirrors and chandeliers, now stared at blank walls and dim light, their reflections extinguished. This transformation was symbolic, a deliberate inversion of their past, reducing eternity to silence, sanctity to confinement. Was this inversion meant as punishment, or was it ritual? A final act of unmaking that erased not only bodies, but the very idea of monarchy itself. When the house was demolished in 1977, decades after the execution, its absence became yet another layer of silence. The official explanation was practical, yet many saw it as an attempt to bury the memory once more. The ground where it stood was left bare, as if the earth itself bore guilt. Later, churches rose on the site, sanctifying what had been desecrated. Yet even these sanctuaries carry the paradox of silence, holy walls erected over absence, prayers whispered over uncertainty. If the Romanovs died there, why was their memory treated with such unease? And if they did not, what does the destruction of the house conceal? The Apatov house remains a wound, a place where history is simultaneously remembered and erased. Its walls are gone, yet its silence persists, echoing louder than stone. The captivity within it is recorded only in fragments, conflicting testimonies and rumors too persistent to dismiss. The contradictions themselves serve as a cover-up. Certainty dissolves when every version clashes. Did all die together? Did some escape? Were bodies moved, hidden, or substituted? Each possibility lingers unresolved, ensuring that the house remains not a closed chapter but an open labyrinth of doubt. Thus, the Romanovs' final dwelling stands as a paradox. It was both a prison and a stage, both a site of execution and a vault of mystery. Its destruction erased stone but not suspicion, leaving us forever to wonder. Was the Apatov house a place of ending, or was it a veil drawn across truths too dangerous to reveal? When the walls of the Apatov house fell silent, the task of shaping memory passed into the hands of those who ruled in the dynasty's absence. Here begins one of the most deliberate cover-ups of modern history, the Soviet rewrite. In the years after 1918, official accounts of the Romanovs' fate were marked not by clarity but by calculated omission. The Bolsheviks announced the execution of Nicholas II, yet withheld mention of Alexandra and the children. Reports contradicted each other, some declaring the entire family dead, others suggesting the Tsar alone had perished. This ambiguity was no accident. By refusing to state the truth plainly, the regime ensured that memory became a fog where rumor flourished, but certainty could not. The Soviet rewriting of history extended beyond the family's fate. Portraits of the Romanovs vanished from museums, their names excised from textbooks, their achievements recast as failures or crimes. What had once been depicted as sanctity was now framed as decadence. What had been described as duty became tyranny. The dynasty's 3 centuries of rule were compressed into a narrative of oppression that justified revolution as inevitable. Yet within this narrative were cracks. Archives sealed, testimonies destroyed, documents censored. Why conceal so much if the truth was already damning? Perhaps because the truth contained fragments that contradicted the official story, fragments that revealed survival, complicity, or mysteries too dangerous for a regime built on control. In schools, children learned of the Tsar as an oppressor, his family barely mentioned. Churches were stripped of icons bearing imperial faces, liturgies purged of prayers for rulers long erased. Even the memory of their burial was suppressed. When whispers spread of shallow graves and forests, the state denied them, dismissing them as fantasies of counter-revolutionaries. Yet each denial only deepened suspicion, convincing many that something was being concealed. Was the silence evidence of shame, or was it a deliberate veil drawn to obscure truths that could destabilize the new order? The rewriting of history also required the rewriting of symbols. The double-headed eagle, ancient emblem of Russia, was cast aside, replaced by the hammer and sickle. Streets once named for Romanovs were renamed for revolutionaries. Palaces were converted into museums or offices, their walls stripped of dynastic portraits. Yet their architecture remained as ghostly reminders of the erased past. Visitors walked corridors where Nicholas and Alexandra once lived, but the narratives on plaques and displays told only of exploitation, never of humanity. In this inversion, the dynasty was not merely forgotten, but transformed into a caricature, a cautionary tale intended to validate the present, yet memory resists erasure. Among émigrés abroad, the story of the Romanovs was preserved in letters, in icons smuggled from Russia, and in songs whispered in exile. Within Russia itself, older generations passed down fragments of memory to children, speaking cautiously of a time when the Tsar was called Little Father. This underground memory clashed with official silence, creating a tension that endured for decades. The cover-up was never complete, for truth has a way of surviving in shadows. But shadows themselves became part of the concealment, blurring clarity and ensuring that certainty remained just out of reach. When investigators finally reopened the question decades later, they confronted a landscape distorted by years of suppression. Documents had vanished, like testimonies were contradictory, and physical evidence was scattered. The Soviet rewrite had not destroyed history entirely, but had fractured it, leaving behind a puzzle with missing pieces. Perhaps this was always the intention, not to erase, but to fragment, so that reconstruction would be impossible. Fragmented memory is more malleable than erased memory, easier to shape into whatever narrative power requires. The Soviet silence persisted until the twilight of the regime, when revelations of graves in the Ural forests emerged. Even then, the state hesitated, acknowledging fragments while concealing details. Bodies were said to be discovered, yet not all. Explanations were offered, but not complete. The narrative was never allowed to settle into finality. Why, after so many decades, was truth still treated as dangerous? Perhaps because the cover-up was not only about the Romanovs' deaths, but about what their survival or partial survival might have revealed regarding the forces that shaped the 20th century. Thus, the Soviet rewrite stands as one of the greatest acts of historical concealment. It was not silence alone, but manipulation, a deliberate reshaping of memory to fit ideology. In erasing the Romanovs, the regime sought to erase continuity, to sever Russia from its past and anchor it in a new myth. Yet myths are fragile, and silence echoes louder than words. The dynasty's story, once buried, returned in whispers, in rumors, in contradictions that refused to align. And so we are left to ask, was the Soviet rewrite merely propaganda, or was it part of a deeper cover-up that transcends politics? a concealment of truth still hidden in sealed archives and unopened vaults. From the Soviet rewriting of memory, we move deeper into the labyrinth, into the shadowed corridors where archives should have spoken but instead fell silent. The story of the Romanovs is not only of lives lost, but of letters, diaries, and photographs that vanished, some destroyed deliberately, others quietly altered. Still others found a way to reappear decades later under circumstances too convenient to trust. History does not erase itself. Erasure requires intention, and intention points to hands that understood the danger of leaving truth intact. If the dynasty was gone, why fear their words unless those words contained keys to mysteries too dangerous to release? Letters between Nicholas and Alexandra once spoke of faith, of their children, of omens that guided decisions. Some of these remain, yet others disappeared entirely. Their gaps were felt more than seen. Diaries were censored, entries missing, phrases crossed out in ink, darker than time. Even photographs, images that should have been immutable, reappeared, cropped or retouched, faces missing, expressions softened, the weight of sorrow erased by unseen editors. Each alteration is itself a testimony of someone who wished to shape not only how the dynasty lived, but how they would be remembered. Among immigrants, fragments of letters surfaced that contradicted official accounts, suggesting that the family's captivity was less uniform than reported, that movements occurred between houses, and that children were seen after their supposed deaths. Some of these documents were dismissed as forgeries, while others were locked away in private collections. Why would forgeries proliferate unless genuine documents were also in circulation, creating the need to bury truth beneath noise? The presence of fakes may itself be evidence of a cover-up, for the surest way to hide a real document is to surround it with imitations until all credibility collapses. Even within the Soviet Union, rumors of concealed archives persisted. Investigators who gained access reported rooms filled with locked cabinets, files labeled with cryptic codes, and sealed envelopes never opened. Some spoke of boxes removed under cover of night, their contents never cataloged. The Soviet regime had every reason to control the narrative, yet their secrecy seemed excessive, as though their concern was not merely political embarrassment, but something more profound. Did these documents reveal survival, foreign involvement, or mystical practices tied to the dynasty? Each possibility lingers in the fog created by absence. When graves were finally uncovered in the Ural forests, documents reappeared to confirm the official narrative, yet their timing was suspicious. Reports once thought lost were suddenly produced, matching the needs of the moment. Were these genuine or carefully prepared reconstructions seeded to close the question once and for all? The discovery of remains did not silence doubt, but inflamed it. For science can prove bones, but it cannot prove intentions. If some remains were missing or some identities uncertain, then the possibility of concealment endures. The archive, instead of clarifying, became another chamber of the labyrinth. Photographs tell their own story of concealment. Family portraits exist in multiple versions. One with Rasputin, one without, one with all children, another with faces blurred or removed. Was this simply the result of technical limitations, or a deliberate erasure meant to rewrite relationships even in exile? Émigrés displayed portraits that differed subtly from official versions, as though memory itself had been tampered with. What is a photograph if not a fragment of truth captured in time? And what is its alteration if not evidence of fear that truth might survive? The most chilling question is this: if the Romanovs were truly gone, why invest decades of effort in controlling their memory? Why not allow letters, diaries, and photographs to circulate freely, their tragedy standing as proof of revolutionary triumph? The intensity of concealment suggests that the dynasty's end was not as simple as execution, that there were threads connecting their fate to wider networks of power, faith, and secrecy. By erasing documents, the regime erased not only memory, but the possibility of revelation. Yet, erasure is never complete. Scholars have found annotations in margins, faint imprints of words removed, and photographs whose ghosts appear beneath retouching. Memory survives in fragments too stubborn to die, in shadows that refuse to vanish. The very act of concealment draws attention to the existence of something worth hiding. Thus, the missing archive becomes a paradox. Its silence louder than words, its absence proof of presence. What was so dangerous in those letters, diaries, and photographs that decades of power labored to ensure their disappearance? In this chamber of memory, the Romanovs remain suspended between presence and absence, between word and silence, between photograph and shadow. The archives do not clarify. They in concealment, and in concealment they reveal the intentions of those who feared truth more than myth. And so the question persists, unanswerable yet unavoidable. Was history rewritten to erase a dynasty or to erase what that dynasty knew? From the vanished archives, another path emerges, leading eastward into realms of mysticism and secrecy that surrounded the dynasty long before the revolution brought its downfall. The Romanovs were guardians of orthodoxy, crowned in the sanctity of incense and liturgy. Yet beneath this official devotion lay threads of esoteric practice, connections whispered but never confirmed, ties to hidden brotherhoods and Eastern traditions that left their mark on the family's private life. In letters and diaries, Alexandra often spoke of visions, dreams, and prophecies, words that suggest a faith less bound by doctrine than by mystical experience. Rasputin's influence revealed only the surface of this fascination. Beneath it lay a deeper current that tied the dynasty to forces older and stranger than the church that crowned them. Russia itself has always been a frontier between West and East, a land where orthodoxy meets shamanism, where Byzantine ritual intersects with pagan survival, and where Sufi mystics and Buddhist lamas whispered prayers in shadows, not far from imperial palaces. The Romanovs, though defenders of the church, could not help but be drawn into this landscape of secrets. Travelers brought relics from Siberia, icons rumored to hold powers beyond sanctity, and talismans said to guard against fate. Some accounts suggest that Nicholas and Alexandra received such gifts, incorporating them quietly into their private rituals, never publicly admitting that the guardians of orthodoxy might also be seekers of hidden knowledge. What does it mean when a dynasty sanctified by faith also courts the shadows of forbidden wisdom? Rasputin's presence only magnified this suspicion. He was not merely a healer, but a conduit of mystical energy, blending Orthodox prayer with techniques that echoed shamanic trances. He spoke in visions, prophesied with confidence, and left the family convinced that their fate was bound to forces beyond politics. Yet Rasputin was not unique. He was part of a broader current of holy men, visionaries, and occultists who circulated in late imperial Russia, offering insight into destiny at a time when destiny seemed uncertain. Some came from the East, carrying teachings of theosophy, Buddhism, and Persian mysticism, ideas that blended uneasily with the Romanovs' faith. Were these influences mere curiosities, or were they woven into the dynasty's worldview, hidden beneath the surface of ritual? Legends persist of Romanov interest in prophecy. Nicholas is said to have read accounts of seers who foretold Russia's collapse, including prophecies linking his reign to fire and blood. Alexandra, steeped in mysticism, surrounded herself with icons said to perform miracles and relics that promised protection. Some whispered that the dynasty possessed manuscripts older than Russia itself. Texts of Eastern origin passed through secret channels containing warnings and hidden truths. If such relics existed, were they destroyed in the revolution or locked away in archives now silent? Perhaps the cover-up was not only political, but spiritual. The erasure of a dynasty that held knowledge dangerous to both state and church. The fascination with the East was not confined to superstition. The empire's expansion into Siberia and Central Asia brought the Romanovs into contact with cultures steeped in mystical traditions. Shamans, monks, and wanderers entered their orbit, sometimes as curiosities, sometimes as advisors. Reports exist of strange objects delivered to the court, carved stones inscribed with unknown symbols, scrolls from Tibetan monasteries, and amulets said to carry protection from curses. Few of these were catalogued. Fewer still survived the revolution. What if their disappearance was deliberate, part of the same concealment that erased diaries and photographs? What truths might have been buried with them? Truths suggesting that the dynasty's role was not only political, but spiritual, part of a struggle between hidden forces stretching across continents. The paradox is striking. The Romanovs projected an image of sanctity rooted in orthodoxy, yet behind the mask lay currents of mysticism that blurred the boundaries of faith. Their belief in prophecy, their reliance on mystics, and their possession of relics and icons rumored to hold strange powers all suggest a family not entirely governed by tradition, but open to secrets whispered from the East. Was this openness their downfall, allowing manipulation by figures like Rasputin? Or was it evidence that they knew more than official history allows, that they were custodians of truths erased by revolution? In this fog of rumor and fragment, the dynasty becomes more than rulers of Russia. They became initiates of mysteries, guardians of secrets concealed by silence, the erasers of their own family. They were not only the erasers of monarchy, but also of hidden knowledge carried through bloodlines, relics, and whispered prayers. If revolution silenced them, it also silenced what they knew. And so we are left to wonder, was the dynasty destroyed to end tyranny, or was it destroyed to bury truths that could never be spoken? From the shadows of the East, our path turns westward again into the courts and palaces of Europe, where the Romanovs' bloodline was entwined with nearly every reigning house. In theory, this web of kinship should have offered them protection, yet in reality, it became another veil of silence. Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and beyond. In each of these monarchies, cousins and relatives sat upon thrones, sipping from the same genealogical chalice. The dynasty was never alone, yet when revolution closed in, these bonds dissolved into whispers, evasions, and closed doors. Was this abandonment merely political caution, or was it something deeper, a collective agreement to cloak the family's end in silence? Consider the uncanny resemblance between Nicholas II and King George V of Britain. Photographs of the cousins show men who might have been twins, their faces so alike that rumors arose of substitution, of doubles exchanged in times of peril. If such resemblances existed, could they have been used to conceal survival, to protect heirs by disguising them as cousins? The very possibility unsettles history, for it suggests that survival could hide in plain sight, shielded by the mask of kinship. Yet Britain, instead of sheltering the family, withdrew its offer of asylum. Why would a cousin so alike in appearance refuse sanctuary unless secrecy demanded it? Germany, bound to the Romanovs through Alexandra's Hessian blood, offered no rescue either. Though Kaiser Wilhelm expressed private concern, France, which had relied heavily on Russian alliances in war, distanced itself from the dynasty's fall with remarkable swiftness. Even Denmark, homeland of Nicholas's mother, offered only silence. What greater paradox exists than a dynasty bound to all of Europe by blood, yet abandoned by all when blood demanded loyalty? Was this silence born of fear of Bolshevik contagion, or was it deliberate complicity, a pact to let the Romanovs vanish for reasons never admitted among émigrés? Whispers grew that survival was deliberately concealed by foreign monarchies, that a daughter or son had been spirited away to a European convent, hidden in plain sight among relatives who shared the same features and blood. Some claimed Anastasia lived quietly under another name in a Danish estate, others that Alexei was sheltered by German nobility. None of these claims were confirmed, yet their persistence suggests that the silence was too deep, too consistent to be mere coincidence. If no one survived, why did every court act as though something needed concealing? The European cloak extended beyond asylum. Archives in royal households contained letters, photographs, and testimonies never released, files locked in vaults and marked for restricted eyes. When occasional fragments emerged, they often contradicted Soviet narratives, yet they were quickly withdrawn or dismissed. Was this protection of the Romanovs' memory or protection of the monarchies themselves, whose ties to the dynasty might reveal secrets better left in darkness? If the Romanovs carried relics, documents, or esoteric traditions, perhaps these were absorbed quietly into European collections, where their presence could be denied, while their power remained hidden. Silence also served political necessity. The First World War had shattered Europe, and monarchies were falling under the weight of revolution and disillusionment. To associate openly with the Romanovs, executed as symbols of tyranny, risked contagion. It was perhaps safer to let them vanish into obscurity, to avoid provoking questions about the fragility of all thrones. Yet the uniformity of silence across nations, across cousins, across archives, suggests something more coordinated than caution. Was there an unspoken agreement, a veil drawn collectively to erase not only a family, but also what their survival might have revealed? The paradox of the European cloak lies in its duality. On one hand, it abandoned the Romanovs to their fate. On the other, it may have sheltered fragments of their bloodline, hidden survivors among relatives, concealed in convents or estates where names could be changed and identities obscured. Both possibilities fuel suspicion. Whether abandoned or hidden, the dynasty's truth was denied to history. If they truly perished, why the silence of cousins? If they survived, why the silence of archives? Silence itself becomes evidence, too coordinated to be accidental. Thus, the Romanovs remain suspended within the web of European royalty, neither fully erased nor fully remembered. Their bloodline persists in reigning houses even today. Yet their story remains fractured, obscured, incomplete. The cloak of silence ensured continuity of power at the cost of truth, a sacrifice that preserved monarchies while burying mysteries. We are left with the enduring question: did Europe abandon its kin out of fear or conceal their survival out of necessity? Either way, the result is the same. A dynasty hidden not only in graves but in silence, woven across the continent like a shroud. From this European cloak of silence, we return to the realm of science, where the 20th and 21st centuries attempted to close the Romanov mystery with the precision of DNA. In the forests near Yekaterinburg, shallow graves were unearthed decades after the execution, revealing bones, fragments of clothing, jewels hidden in seams, and traces of violence. Investigators announced that the remains belonged to the Romanov family, and later forensic analysis claimed to confirm it. History seemed ready to declare finality. Yet the closer one examines these revelations, the more contradictions appear, as though science itself had become another instrument of concealment rather than illumination. The first grave, discovered secretly in 1979 and publicly confirmed in 1991, contained only 9 bodies, not the 11 reported to have died in the cellar. Missing were 2 children, Alexei and one of his sisters, presumed to be Anastasia or Maria. This absence reignited suspicion rather than silenced it. If the execution had been total, where were the missing bodies? Officials claimed they were burned separately, their remains destroyed beyond recovery. Yet evidence of fire was inconsistent. Years later, a second grave was found containing fragments said to belong to the missing children. Again, science intervened, DNA tests proclaimed authenticity, and the narrative seemed complete. But the puzzle of absence and belated discovery lingers, leaving doubt like an unhealed wound. DNA testing was heralded as conclusive, yet even here, anomalies remain. Samples matched living relatives of the Romanovs, including Prince Philip of Britain. Questions about methodology, contamination, and selective release of data persist. Some scientists called the testing rigorous. Others noted inconsistencies in chains of custody and results that required assumptions. If the truth was so certain, why did disagreements linger among experts? Why were some results locked in classified files, accessible only to select institutions, when science is withheld rather than shared? Suspicion deepens for concealment can even wear the mask of certainty. Forensic examinations revealed curious details. Some bones bore multiple bullet wounds, others signs of bayonet strikes. Yet the distribution of injuries did not match official testimonies of the execution. Was chaos to blame or deliberate obfuscation in reports? Certain skulls were said to be missing, yet fragments later appeared in state archives. Were they overlooked or withheld? The inconsistency fuels suspicion that remains may have been moved, altered, or even substituted to fit a predetermined narrative. What if the graves were not final resting places, but carefully arranged cover stories constructed to satisfy public demand for closure while hiding truths too dangerous to acknowledge? The Russian Orthodox Church itself refused to fully accept the DNA findings, continuing to express doubt and declining to canonize the remains as authentic relics. Their hesitation is telling. The Church, once bound to the Romanovs as sacred rulers, sensed the weight of uncertainty. If even sanctity hesitates, how can certainty be claimed? Perhaps the Church recognized that the story of the dynasty's end was too entangled with cover-ups, too fractured by silence, to be healed by science alone. Meanwhile, Western institutions largely accepted the findings, eager to close the question. Ceremonies of reburial were conducted, speeches proclaimed, history resolved, and textbooks began to treat the Romanov deaths as settled fact. Yet beneath this facade of certainty, anomalies continued to whisper. Some immigrants insisted the bones did not match the family's stature. Others pointed to missing dental evidence. Still others noted the suspicious timing of discoveries coinciding with political shifts in Russia. Was the resurrection of bones a tool of legitimacy wielded to stabilize regimes by offering closure? And if closure was the true goal, then truth may have been secondary to narrative. Science, when wielded transparently, is a light, but when wielded selectively, it becomes another veil. The Romanovs, tested and proclaimed authentic, may indeed belong to the family. Yet the persistence of anomalies, contradictions, and withheld data ensures that suspicion endures. What if DNA was used not to reveal, but to silence, to cloak the story with the authority of certainty, while ensuring that deeper questions remain unasked? Thus, the Romanov mystery survives even in the age of forensics. Graves may be uncovered, bones examined, DNA sequenced, yet the paradox remains. Evidence intended to resolve only deepens uncertainty, for its very handling carries the scent of concealment. And so the dynasty lingers in ambiguity, suspended between bone and legend, science and silence, proof and doubt. Was DNA the final key? Or was it the final lock, sealing a story that will never be fully told? From bones unearthed in shallow graves and DNA proclaimed as certainty, we drift toward the afterlife of the dynasty, a presence that endures not in palaces or armies, but in memory, myth, and silence. The Romanovs, whether erased completely or hidden in fragments, have never truly left the stage of history. Their images linger in portraits, their names whispered in churches, their story retold in novels, films, and whispered conspiracy. The official narrative declares finality, yet the persistence of legend proves otherwise. What other dynasty, executed in secrecy, still exerts such fascination across continents a century later? Perhaps because their end never felt complete. Perhaps because cover-ups leave questions that refuse to die. Canonization by the Russian Orthodox Church sanctified the family as passion bearers, martyrs not for political rule, but for endurance in suffering. Pilgrims travel to Catherineburg, where churches rise on the site of execution, where prayers echo through chambers once filled with gunfire. Yet even sanctity cannot erase contradiction. Some worship the family as saints, others remember them as oppressors, still others as mysteries unresolved. Their afterlife becomes paradoxical, both holy and haunting, both reverent and suspicious. If truth were complete, would memory fracture so deeply, or does the very act of canonization serve as another layer of concealment, sanctity covering absence with ritual? In Western imagination, the Romanovs became symbols of lost innocence, their daughters cast as tragic princesses, Anastasia in particular immortalized as the one who might have escaped. Films soften the horror. Legends blur brutality, transforming the story into fairy tale. This reshaping is itself a form of cover-up. By romanticizing their story, the true weight of blood and silence is diluted. Yet the myth serves its purpose: to keep the dynasty alive, not as rulers, but as eternal figures of fascination. They survive not through thrones, but through stories that refuse to vanish. In politics, too, their afterlife lingers. Modern Russia grapples with their memory uneasily, sometimes embracing them as victims of revolution, other times minimizing them as relics of tyranny. Monuments rise, archives open partially, yet contradictions persist. Some documents remain sealed, some remain still disputed, some testimonies withheld. Even in an age of information, the Romanovs remain shrouded in fog, as though their story can never be fully revealed. Perhaps this is intentional. Perhaps their cover-up was not a single act of erasure, but an ongoing condition, a veil stretched across centuries to keep certain truths perpetually out of reach. What truths might those be? Did survival occur, hidden in convents or estates, guarded by cousins whose silence was more telling than denial? Did the dynasty carry relics, manuscripts, or esoteric knowledge that threatened both church and state? Did their entanglement with European monarchies make them too dangerous to preserve, for their testimony could have revealed complicity across thrones? Each question remains unanswered. Yet each persists because concealment ensures curiosity. History seeks finality, but cover-up ensures ambiguity. And ambiguity is the Romanovs' true afterlife: unresolved, unsettled, unending. Perhaps this is why their story resonates so powerfully. The Romanovs embody the paradox of history itself: fragile yet eternal, silenced yet never silent, erased yet forever present. Their dynasty began in crisis, crowned in sanctity, enthroned in splendor, and ended in shadows. Yet their absence became presence, their silence became voice, their erasure became memory. They haunt the archives that conceal them, the graves that refuse to yield all bodies, the legends that blur truth and invention. They remind us that history is not a record of what happened, but of what is permitted to be remembered. Their afterlife endures not in palaces or armies, but in questions that will not die. Each generation peers into the fog, seeking clarity, only to find deeper silence. Perhaps this is the ultimate cover-up: not bullets or graves, but the endless flow of truth, the refusal to allow certainty. For in uncertainty lies control, and in silence lies power. The Romanovs, erased in life, remain eternal in ambiguity. Their dynasty still unfolds in whispers, their ghosts refusing to rest. The story of the Romanovs does not end with the discovery of bones or the canonization of saints. Endings in history are illusions written only to comfort those who fear uncertainty. What remains is an echo, a faint reverberation stretching across time, lingering in vaults, archives, and whispers carried by those who remember. Their dynasty was declared extinguished, yet its afterlife reveals itself in absence: missing letters, contradictory testimonies, silences too precise to be accidental. History seeks closure, but the Romanovs remind us that closure is the rarest of illusions. In their fate lies a mirror of our own struggle with the past. We search for certainty, yet the very act of searching exposes concealment. We ask for truth, yet truth is presented in fragments, curated, edited, polished, until it no longer resembles truth at all. The Romanovs, once enthroned as guardians of orthodoxy, became guardians of silence. Their voices denied, their story refracted through propaganda, myth, and longing. What remains is not history, but memory shaped by doubt, the kind of memory that feels heavier than fact because it demands endless interpretation. Perhaps this is why their story continues to haunt. It is not the jewels, the palaces, or the blood that holds us, but the fog that surrounds them. A dynasty erased becomes more powerful than a dynasty preserved. For in erasure lies imagination, and in imagination lies eternity. The Romanovs remind us that history is never fully written. Beneath every official page lies a palimpsest of shadows, faint words that refuse to vanish. So tonight, as we close the final page of their labyrinth, we do not seal it shut. We leave it open, the candle flickering, the silence lingering. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved but carried. And the Romanovs, silenced in life, will forever speak in whispers that history cannot contain.